Let's start with the important thing. Can everybody hear me? Well, this is really thrilling to be here, I have to say. I think all authors would probably join me in saying this, but when you write a book, it's a fairly lonely process. You're alone in your room, you don't know if anybody will care. So it's so thrilling to have an audience, to have people who are here. They were turning people away at the door, which is particularly exciting. So I thank you. Now, I have developed a somewhat unusual expertise as a reporter. I have now written 3 books about 100-year-olds from the social register. And for a nice middle-class Jewish girl from Rochester, whose father's an accountant, whose mother's a social worker, this is not my world. It has been social anthropology. My first book, which I'll be talking about today, was about Brooke Astor. She died at age 105. My second book was about a copper heiress named Huguette Clark. She died at age 104. My third book, which is about Bunny Mellon, who I'll be talking about tomorrow, died at age 103. I think you're beginning to see a pattern here. Every time a 102-year-old dies, people call me and say, "Is that your next book?" Which it's not. But I chased the news, and all of these women, towards the end of their lives, became involved in some kind of headline-making scandal, which is how I got involved. And I want to roll you back through time. It is the summer of 2005, and I, at that point, was a contract writer for New York Magazine. I wrote a lot about politics, Mike Bloomberg. I did a year on 911. I wrote about actors, celebrities, kind of a generalist for the magazine. And I was asked by Adam Moss, the editor, to write a piece about Brooke Astor. At that point, she was born in 1902, so she was 103 years old. And yet she was a beloved figure in New York. Her third husband had been Vincent Astor, whose parents went down with the Titanic. And it was not a happy marriage, but when he died after 5 years, Brooke was left with a $60 million foundation, another $60 million or more in assets, and she decided she wanted to be influential. And she kind of kicked out the men who were running the foundation, and she took it over herself. And she was beloved because she wanted to research kind of anywhere her money was going. She wanted it all to be in New York because Astor money had come out of real estate in New York. So she would go out to scary neighborhoods, give money for education, for civil rights things, for outdoor parks, but she always went herself in her pearls. I wear my Brooke Astor pearls and her Chanel outfits. And she was also, everyone thought of her as being just really fun. I don't know if you remember the Bill Cunningham photos in the New York Times on Sundays. She was in every week. She went to every party. She also was known as kind of being democratic in a way. She loved to mix people up, so she would have her rich socialite friends, but she would have curators, she would have authors, she would have politicians. So really a wonderful figure, but by the time I was asked to write about her, she hadn't been seen around for a while. Nobody really knew much about her. And after all these years, so the question really is, what has happened? So I began to make phone calls, and one of the first people I called was her son, Tony Marshall. Now, you need a wall chart here, but he was the son of Brooke's first marriage to a man named Dryden Kuzer, who she divorced. And then she married a man named Buddy Marshall, who was a stockbroker. Tony so disliked his father that he took his stepfather's name. So I called Tony and said, I've been asked to do this story. Can I come talk to you? And he couldn't have been more charming on the phone. He said, come on over. This is a man who's almost out of central casting in terms of WASDom, very patrician looking, had gone to prep schools, had gone to Brown, had served, sort of almost ran away from high school to volunteer in the Marines, wounded, Purple Star, worked for the CIA, then worked on Wall Street. He was a producer. So I was intrigued to meet him, but he'd always been known as Brooke Astor's son. It was like the comma after his name. So I go to the apartment, and it is one of the weirder interviews because his wife, Charlene, the evil Charlene, known as Miss Piggy by the staff, but I didn't know that then. She was sort of sitting in the corner, and they have this dog, Pichu, and Tony announces, I've decided I don't want to talk about my mother. I thought I'd talk about myself. I thought, oh, you're hijacking the interview. But I was interested, I'd chat with him, but every time I would bring the conversation back to his mother, he would get really tense. Charlene would cut me off. The dog would start barking furiously. And I thought, this is really odd. So I made a bunch of phone calls and to people I knew a little bit in the social world, and I began to hear these stories about how Brooke's favorite painting, A Child Hassan, which she'd always promised to the Metropolitan Museum where she was on the board, had gone missing. No one knew what had happened to it. That Charlene had been seen on TV, she and her husband had won a Tony wearing Brooke's jewels, that there were stories that her country house had been shut down, that people had been having trouble getting in to see Brooke. There was a whole list of visitors. But I couldn't really figure out what was going on. And when you're a writer, if you don't write the story, you don't get paid. So after 3 weeks, I said to my editors, I don't really know what I have, so let me, I'll put it aside, maybe I'll work on some other things. And I felt like a failure, and I'm normally a really disorganized person, let me confess, but I thought, so I put everything in this really organized, every interview, everybody I'd called, the whole list, all this stuff. So, calendar pages, flapping in the breeze. It's the next summer, June 2006, and my husband and I have rented a place in Martha's Vineyard, and we're going to drive up that day. I open the front door, and there is this huge Daily News headline, "Disaster for Mrs. Astor." And on that, the day before, her grandson, Philip Marshall, had gone to court, backed by that all-star team of Annette de la Renta, Henry Kissinger, and David Rockefeller, and sued Brooke's son, the man I had met with, for essentially allowing Brooke to live in squalor, mismanaging her money, stealing things. So it was this huge scandal. But I'm leaving town, and New York is on holiday. So I throw everything in the car. I had Brooke's 2 autobiographies or books, and we're driving. And when the cinematic moments, the ferry docks in Martha's Vineyard, and I get the call from New York Magazine saying, we want the story. I am now in the wrong city, because all the action is in New York. It's at the hospital. Brooke's been taken to the hospital. It's people staking out, Tony Marshall's apartment. I'm in a house in the woods with bad internet. But they said to me, if you can get us a story in 48 hours, great. So it was one of those moments where, you just feel like the hand comes down from the sky and saying, you got to do this thing. Because I had this organized list, I discovered where every socialite vacation. I'm calling Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I'm calling the Hamptons. I reached Lord Astor, relative by marriage. Because I had talked to Tony Marshall, I was able to reach the son, Philip, and who agreed to speak to me. So I literally, in my 48 hours, I wrote the story, turned it in on Friday, and on Saturday I'm walking on the beach with my husband, and I cannot tell you how many books I had proposed, which nobody wanted. And I walked on the beach and I said, Walter, I am so not done with these people. How does a family like this just explode in public? What happened? Something must have happened a lot of years ago for everything to lead to this moment. And got in touch with my agent. She said, write something fast. I wrote 1,200 words. She said, publishers want to meet you. I flew back to New York in my jeans, put on the pearls, had meetings, went back to the airport, and literally I'm waiting for the plane, and 5 publishers got in a bidding war. So it was kind of one of these amazing experiences. Then, of course, I had your classic writer's breakdown, because I come back to New York, and this story is still hot, and nobody will talk to me. I'm just getting I'm calling, nobody wants to do this, and I'm thinking, just got an advance, and now I have to return it? And then I had this moment of realizing, I have to go where Brooke Astor went. This is a woman who went out every single night to every single benefit and party. As many of you know, a lot of these big charity galas have press. So I called a bunch of places and I said, can I come? And I went out, and it's a lot harder to turn someone down who's wearing, her pearls in an evening gown than to just not pick up the phone. And one of the first places I went to was Living Landmarks, where Brooke had given money. She'd been named a Living Landmark. And there were all sorts of people there who were involved in one way or another in this scandal. There was Peter Dushin, who's the Society Orchestra leader. He knew her. He had played for her. There was Mike Wallace from CBS, who turned out to be a good friend of Tony Marshall's. And there was Tom Brokaw, who I knew socially. And Tom said, call me, I have a great Brooke Astor story. So I did. And while we're on the phone, he said, I was just talking, he would just come back from, he'd just seen Nancy Reagan. And I knew that Nancy and Brooke had been very close friends. And I said, Tom, do you have Nancy Reagan's number? And he said, yes. So I called, and Mrs. Reagan's social secretary said, she doesn't do interviews anymore. I'm really sorry, but she won't want to talk to you. 10 minutes later, she said, Mrs. Reagan loved Brooke Astor. So I got Nancy Reagan on the phone, who began to talk about how we all knew something was terribly wrong. She was very close to Annette de Lorenta, but we didn't know quite what was wrong. So that is how I began my reporting in the fall of 2006. And what was fascinating for me, I felt like Columbo, remember Columbo in his raincoat? Well, I was just going from one amazing Park Avenue, Fifth Avenue apartment to the next, meeting a lot of the people who were on the board of the Metropolitan Museum with Brooke, meeting her friends, meeting the curators, and again, following this story. And it evolved in many different stages because that original guardianship suit was settled. Brooke was allowed to, Annette de Lorenta became her guardian. Chase Manhattan took over her finances. It was settled at that point with Tony giving back money. But one of the things, they began looking at all of Brooke Astor's wills and various things, and there was a codicil that a forgery expert said had been forged. So that started the DA's office investigating. So DA's office is investigating, I'm investigating, we're all looking at all of these things. And early on, a close friend of mine from the New York Times said that she had covered an event that Brooke Astor had spoken at a couple years earlier, and it was a New York Public Library where she was also on the board with Vartan Gregorian, and that she'd given a really kind of odd speech. And I was able to get a copy of that speech, and she kind of tottered up to the thing, and she began by saying, I married a bad man. And that sent me off in quest of biography. What I learned, Brooke's father was a Marine Corps general, and she'd grown up overseas. When she was a teenager, her parents were back in Washington. Suddenly they really didn't have much money as compared to the kind of money you get when you're working for the government in other countries. And her mother really wanted her to marry well. In fact, pulled her out of the Madeira school over Brooke. Brooke was always, she loved education the rest of her life because she was so angry that her mother was afraid she would become unmarriageable if she finished high school. And she became a voracious reader. She went to a dance at Princeton, and she met a man named Dryden Kuzer. He looked great on paper. Father was head of a power company in New Jersey, one of the early investors in Fox movie studios. His mother's family had started an insurance company, good student. And so Brooke got married as a teenager and immediately realized this was a terrible idea because her husband was an alcoholic, he was a philanderer, and he also was a wife beater, which Brooke did not acknowledge till fairly late in her life. I had chills down my spine when I was allowed to see the home in New Jersey where she'd lived with her husband, because you could sort of be in those rooms and you could know what happened. Brooke more or less implied in one of her books that her son Anthony was the product of a marital rape. So when you're looking back to where did everything go wrong, she loved her son, but she had a really hard time bonding with him. I mean, he reminded her he looked like his father, and it was always a sort of push-pull with them. She and Dryden Kuzer got divorced, and she marries Buddy Marshall. Buddy didn't like Tony's longtime governess and fired her. I love the fact this is a literary family, because in addition to Brooke writing 2 novels and 2 books, her son wrote a novel in which the poor little kid from the wealthy family and the stepfather murders the nanny. In this case, they only fired the nanny. Tony was shipped off to boarding school as very young. He immediately got into a terrible sledding accident and nearly died. was brought home. But essentially, Brooke was always kind of pushing him away, pulling him away. Vincent Astor also didn't much like Tony. Brooke wrote in her book about how Vincent didn't really want her to spend time and see other people, so she didn't see Tony. So he really grew up having this sense of, not particularly feeling loved and not really having parents. Both of his parents, his mother, in her first divorce papers, had agreed that if she remarried, the money from alimony would go into a trust fund for her son. So she remarries, and that's what happens. But then, poor Tony Marshall, both of his mother and his father kind of went after him for the money. I mean, his mother was sort of twisting his arm when her husband had financial problems. He bought her a pool, he bought her jewelry. His father eventually sued him to try to get the trust fund. So money and love were very intertwined. Now, this is a family with many marriages. Tony had 3 of them, and his two sons were twins, Philip and Alex. Philip is a college professor, Alex, photographer, fraternal twins. Philip pushed the lawsuit. Alec didn't want any part of it, but his father, was like, if you're not taking a side, you're part of it. But so these kids grew up kind of they didn't grow up in Brooke Astor's world. They grew up in Massachusetts. They would see their mother. They would see their various their 2 stepmothers. Everything took a big turn in the summer up in Maine. Brooke had this place at Northeast Harbor, Maine, which she adored. And she would go up, and she would be the doyen of the entire, it's a small town, and everybody loved her, and she would hire half the local staff to bring up her. I got a chance to look at a lot of the staff calendars. I mean, all the people and the parties and the dinners and the events and all of that. But there was a new local minister in town, and Brooke decided to give a dinner for the visiting Catherine Graham. And she seated the minister at the head table, and she seated Tony, who'd come up without his wife, with the minister's wife, Charlene, in Siberia. Well, magic struck. And shortly afterwards, I love small town gossip. I was seeing one of Brooke's socialite friends, Nancy Pine, and she said, "Oh, you have to go to the little store in town. Dot and her daughter, they know everything." And it turned out that one of them had been working at Brooke Astor's house that summer, and they couldn't understand when they got there at 6:30 in the morning why the minister's wife was knocking on the door, So everybody knew about the affair. And Charlene left her husband and 3 children to marry Tony. And Brooke was horrified. She felt responsible. She felt responsible for the children. She felt she couldn't go to her church anymore. And ultimately, she reconciled with her son. She bought him an apartment. But she really never liked Charlene. And also Charlene, didn't come from this kind of fancy world. She did things like organize a party at the Knickerbocker Club in New York, very ritzy. You can't use cell phones. She smuggled in a belly dancer for Tony. That didn't go over well with Brooke. So Brooke, feeling the way she felt, she was one of these women who liked to change her wills. I mean, when the court case happened, they wheeled in a tray. There were 52 wills. I mean, some of it was like, let me give Annette the jade necklace instead of the pearl. I mean, she would have these whims. But she ultimately Tony was going to be a very rich man when his mother died. He was going to get her $46 million Park Avenue apartment. He was going to get her country place, Holly Hill, which I think was another $20 million. He was going to get Maine, another $7 or $8 million, $5 million up front, and then $4 million for life. So he was going to be good. He was existing on a salary of managing his mother's money, which was a couple $100,000 a year. She kept him on a fairly short leash, but he would be wealthy. But Tony had a heart attack, series of problems, and Brooke had structured her will that if Tony died before Brooke died, all of that money was going to charity. Charlene would have gotten this fabulous diamond necklace, And then Brooke did something that was really kind of mean-spirited, but kind of funny. Brooke was a size 2, Charlene was a size 12. The Astor money came from fur trading. Brooke left Charlene 2 of her used fur coats. So as you can imagine, once, I mean, it took a while for me to understand. The stage was set for Tony to be desperate to get money, from his mother while she was alive, for the fear that there would be nothing for Charlene. So there were a whole series of things he did, sort of pressuring his mother, at a point when she had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And as any of you, I certainly learned you can still write a new will if you have Alzheimer's, which is a kind of scary thing. It really all depends on are you considered to be competent. But there were all sorts of shenanigans that Tony played, with this, he had wanted to be a philanthropist himself, and Brooke Astor had dangled possibly letting him run the Astor Foundation, and then decided that she was just going to spend the money down. And then he kept twisting her arm because he wanted to be the big man in town giving away the money. So her longtime lawyer, Henry Christensen, agreed to add a new codicil in which Tony would be given $20 million that he could give away. And the lawyer wrote first and last codicil. Pretty unusual writing. It was a way of saying, this is it, Tony, I'm not doing anything else. But what Christensen, who worked for Sullivan Cromwell, did not know was he was putting his seal of approval. If Sullivan Cromwell was saying she was competent to write a first codicil, she could completely change her will. So, literally, a month later, and Barbara Walters had seen Brooke right around, everyone was checking their calendars right around when she signed this first codicil and said, this woman had been my friend for, 30 years, and, Barbara was kind of teared up. Brooke didn't know who I was. She really did not have, So Tony fired Brooke's lawyer and brought in his own team, which then added 2 different codicils, one of which suddenly transferred $60 million to Tony. And then the other was a real estate thing that should have been nothing, and that was the one where the codicil was found forged. Brooke died at home her last year of her life was actually lovely and peaceful. She did something that was really a way of conveying. She had been almost at death's door at the hospital with pneumonia when the lawsuit was filed. She began to eat. She gained 15 pounds, which really showed she cared. She was back with her beloved dogs, Boysie and Girlsie. All the staff who had been fired had been allowed to come back. Oh, I should throw in one thing which turned out to be almost out of Law and Order. She had a butler, Chris Ely, who had worked for Diana in Buckingham Palace, totally devoted to Brooke, had driven her around, had done various things. But he'd been among the people who Tony and Charlene had fired. And Brooke had round-the-clock nurses at home. And they said, well, what do we do? And he kept saying, why don't you just take notes anytime anything happens? So these nurses had all of these notes, which described Brooke being dragged down the hall against her will to sign that will, the nightmares she had afterwards saying, I don't know what I signed. So this, after Brooke died in 2007, literally just a couple of weeks later, Tony was indicted and charged with 16 counts, and his lawyer, Francis Morrissey. The trial went on for 5 months. Now, I was in a funny position because my book came out literally a few months before the trial started. And then I got to cover the trial for Vanity Fair. The poor jury members had been told it would be a 2-month trial, 6 months in that courthouse with an all-star parade of, Graydon Carter, Vanity Fair, Barbara Walters, who didn't want to ask the prosecutor not to ask her age, which I thought was kind of, and the reporters all noticed. For all of this, I was in a really odd position because Tony and Charlene, they were speaking to me, but they weren't speaking to Philip. And sometimes Tony and Charlene would say, tell my son this. And I'd call it Philip, and I just felt like this was this really bizarre situation. And The lawyer, Francis Morrissey, was a really interesting character. His father had been very close to Joseph Kennedy, and Frank had had this bit of a complicated past. He'd been suspended from practicing law, but I had talked to him when working on the book. And the first day of trial, opening arguments, it's 9 o'clock at night, I'm home having my little scotch on the rocks, and the phone rings. It was Frank Morrissey. He was like, well, how do you think it went? I'm thinking, I'm a reporter. You're on trial. You're calling me to ask me how I think it went? So it was an unusual experience to be in the middle of kind of all of this and watching all of this evolve. As some of you may know, Tony Marshall was convicted of 15 of 16 counts. He ultimately did spend time in jail, but he was so old and frail at that point, they didn't keep him for very long, just a couple of weeks. And he died in 2014. A friend had alerted me that he died, and it turned out that Charlene had actually put something in the newspaper, but she didn't mention that, among the survivors, she didn't mention that Tony had sons. So the first thing I did when I saw this was I emailed Philip Marshall to say, I'm really sorry about your father. And he said, what? She hadn't called to tell him that so he heard it from me. I felt terrible about the whole thing, but it was an unusual situation to be in. Charlene, what have they gone on to do? Philip actually left his job about a year or so ago and really is making elder abuse his full-time crusade. He travels around the country. He speaks about it at great length. Charlene sued New York State, saying that they had treated Tony badly. I think he was treated the way everybody's treated. The problem is if you're old and your body isn't working the way it is, and they don't give you special attention. And he had a pretty bad time of it in prison. I ended up with some unusual relationships that helped me in my newest book coming out of that. I had always been terribly intimidated by Annette de Lorenta. I don't know if you've seen, she's always very grand and very fierce and very, and she wouldn't speak to me for the first year or so I was working on the book. And finally, Henry Kissinger did see me, David Rockefeller did see me. They both said to her, Meryl's okay. When I was going to see Annette, I don't know why this was so funny. My mother and my agent and my editor all saying, what are you going to wear? I was like, and yes, it was, I'm going to wear nice jewelry and the most inconspicuous thing I have. But what had been interesting up till then is that Annette really does not do press and doesn't really like the press. But up until then, I'd been trying to see a number of people at the museum, like Philippe de Montebello. And everybody was like, no. After I saw Annette called me and said, when would you like to see? I mean, once she kind of lifted the, and we became friendly coming out of this. And in the summer of 2014, I got my contract for the newest book on Bunny Mellon. And Annette and I had become friendly with Liz Lowy, who was the Astor prosecutor. We'd seen each other a couple times. So Annette and Oscar invited us to go to lunch. Oscar was quite ill at that point, and I told them about the new Bunny Mellon book. I'd literally just gotten the contract, and once again was thinking, no one's going to talk to me. Da, da, da. And the next day, Oscar called me, which doesn't usually happen in my life. And he said, I've done two things for you. He said, I've tracked down a woman named Babs Simpson. She's 102 years old. I see she was one of the top fashion editors at Vogue for many years. She was very close to Bunny. He said, she's in a nursing home up in Westchester. She's got all her marbles. Go now, which I did. And then he said, I've called Hubert de Givenchy, Bunny's closest friend, and asked him to speak with you. I was like, and what a great dying gift. Oscar died like 2 months later, but it really helped me, launch me on this next kind of thing. And a couple things I've learned from doing these books, which relates to all of this, and if any of you come and see me talk about Bunny, you'll hear about this as well. But what I've learned is if you're writing about this world, if you want to talk to people, usually you don't call them, you don't email them, you don't fax them, you don't text them. You write them letters on beautiful monogram stationery, which I'm sure most of you have. And it's amazing in this old-fashioned world. Sometimes I would FedEx the letters, but it was interesting to me that you could get entree, and that ultimately, I was amazed at how many high-powered people were willing to speak with me. But I think once I had these, I'm embarrassing these name-dropping letters, but once Nancy Reagan said yes, if I could write a letter to someone saying, here are the people who are speaking to me, suddenly everybody else says, if she's good enough for Nancy or David Rockefeller, I'll talk to her. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the Astors and their world and the fun level about writing about the super rich or the dangers of codicils. Yes? This was interesting because here's another moment. They believed that they would not get anything from their father. And I was sitting in the trial, and tax lawyers were talking, and it was like incredibly boring. And so almost all the other reporters had left. And there was some document up on the screen talking about Tony's concern about his divorce decree from his first marriage in the 1950s and how that would affect his will. And I called up Philip and I said, I think there's something in your parents' divorce decree that might involve money for you. He said, no, I don't. We looked at this long. I said, well, I think you should look again. His mother went down to the basement 50 years later, and sure enough, the divorce decree had guaranteed that Tony would have to leave his children a large chunk of money. So the New York Times even wrote an article about my exclusive. Meryl Gordon got the exclusive on the money. But here's what was interesting about this. Tony and Alec both got $1 million from their grandmother. And the court-appointed lawyer for Brooke, and for a woman who was worth more than $200 million, that's actually not a lot of money. She had I think she had really felt that her son had been too dependent on her, and so she wanted her grandsons to have their own life. But she hadn't left anything for her 3 grandchildren, or great-grandchildren, so that Brooke's court-appointed lawyer put something in so that Brooke's estate gave $100,000, more than that, to the kids for educational trust. But to end your question, after Tony died, both of his sons basically, they renounced the money. They didn't want their father's money, which I thought was kind of a, honorable thing to do. They said, let Charlene have it, she earned it. Yeah. Yes, in the back. I think so. There are Astors in England that are part of that branch because the family branch split at one point, and Vincent Astor's father, who went down with the Titanic, his wife was pregnant and she lived, and she gave birth to a son, and he has descendants who I think have some link, but Vincent got most of the money from that. Yes?
Well, when her jewels went up to auction, so that money went to her charity?
Went to her charities. Essentially, there was a will fight that was settled. Tony still got some money, but he wasn't an executor of the will. He did get he got the main apartment, the main houses before, but much, much less than if he had been willing to just wait it all out. What was interesting to me, Tony was just an incredibly proud man, and he really didn't think he'd done anything wrong. He was absolutely convinced that, my husband had the chills over the fact that one of the various things that came up in the lawsuit was that Tony came to see his mother one day, and she was sleeping, and he just leaned over and took a picture off the wall and took it home. Leaving her with an empty hook. That was kind of, but when this all began, the prosecutors kept assuming that they would want a plea deal. No one ever thought Tony would go to trial and go to jail. And he was not going to plead guilty. And he just wasn't. So he spent $14 million on legal fees. The whole thing was kind of a disaster for him. And he was very much a broken man. It was really sad, but he was still like, I loved my mother and I didn't do anything wrong. And, I think even the prosecutors were nobody really, when this began, I think for Philip, the notion that there was also a dramatic courtroom day in which, both sons testified. And there they are testifying on the witness stand. There's their father. And passing in the corridor afterwards. It was really quite heartbreaking that they never really had a rapprochement. Interesting, after Tony got out of jail, he reached out towards his great-grandchildren, Philip's son. He wanted to have a relationship, and Philip encouraged them, because thinking, well, I never will, but that doesn't mean you can't know your great-grandfather. Yes?
Did Tony earn any of his own money, or did it all come from his mother?
It pretty much all came from his mother. He managed her money, and so he got a commission for managing her money, but he had not been financially successful on his own. So pretty much he was dependent on her.
But he got the houses, you said.
Oh yeah, no, listen,
Those, and then Charlene might have ended up.
Oh, Charlene, I'm sure.
40, 50 million.
No, I don't think it was that much, because I think at the end, she got Covend, which is Maine, which he's kept, and she got $5 million up front. I'm not sure how much Tony got exactly, but most of the money was, went to charity.
In Mrs. Astor's later years, she was still going out, sort of in her 90s.
Mm-hmm.
She had a gentleman that was a companion. Do you know who that was? He was a tall, kind of nice-looking gentleman. He would have been in his 60s.
She had.
He had an oxygen tank, and they'd come to the Four Seasons restaurant.
I know she was.
He was with her a lot.
Well, she was very close to Lawrence Rockefeller, and there are many people who think they had an affair, and I think they probably did. So that was a close relationship. But then she also had a whole series of younger men, curators, people who worked in the art world who kind of traveled with her, did things with her. She had a nice life.
How many years was she married to Mr. Astor?
5 years, and Vincent, and what was, I think we all think that we invented the moral code. We don't realize that everybody else was having loose lives before us, but Vincent Astor was married 3 times, and his second marriage was to a woman named Minnie Cushing of the famous Cushing sisters, Betsy and Babe, Paley. And Minnie, by various accounts, was actually gay, and she wanted a divorce from Vincent Astor, and he didn't want to give it to her. And shortly after Brooke was widowed, really shortly afterwards, she was kind of fixed up at a dinner party with Vincent and Minnie, and they invited her to the country, and Vincent said, well, Minnie wanted a divorce and I wouldn't give it to her, but now I've met you, so I'll divorce Minnie and marry you. And Brooke always said it wasn't love. She was worried about her financial security. She had $500,000, which seems like a lot of money in the 1950s, but not living the way that she wanted to live. And by all accounts, it was a pretty unhappy marriage, because he had had one of those gothic childhoods where his mother locked him in the closet for days, and just kind of very tortured man. Lungs had been injured during a submarine during World War I, and he wanted Brooke to basically wait on him hand and foot, which she was okay with her, but to have a very isolated life. He didn't want to go out. He didn't want to have parties. He wanted her to stay home and play the piano for him. She was completely isolated, and they were apparently talking about divorce when he died. So it's interesting that she didn't want to marry again, because she was a woman in her 50s, but I think after 3 marriages, she didn't want to take care of anybody who was sick, and I think she just felt like she was going to enjoy her independence, play the field.
And the second marriage, was that?
I think she was very happy. She was very happy for 20 years with Buddy Marshall, a stockbroker related to the Marshall Fields department store fortune, and died suddenly of a heart attack. And he was also divorced, and Brooke then discovered that pretty much all the money was going to his first wife and their children. So suddenly she was kind of on her own. And it's interesting. I mean, this is my, again, third book of women who were born in this kind of era. Huguette Clark was born in 1905. Bunny Millen was born in 1910. And the expectations for women were of well-born women, is they weren't going to work and have their own careers. And I so wonder what their lives would have been like now. You feel like they would have done amazing, great things. Bunny Millen's family and friends really thought she was amazing as an artist, as a decorator, as a garden designer, and she would have been the Martha Stewart of her day had she been doing those kinds of things. Thank you.